My name's Piper, I'm 37, and for a decade, I'd lived a lie my own mother carefully crafted, that I was anything but the board-certified trauma surgeon I actually was. She called me a helper, a nurse, a babysitter. That illusion shattered one scorching July afternoon at my brother's lake house. Just as my mother casually dismissed my career as answering phones to a stranger, my 5-year-old nephew, Colton, slipped beneath the murky green water. Did the truth finally emerge? Yes. In a frantic 90 seconds, my hands, trained on hundreds of dying patients, brought him back. Then, a paramedic's blunt statement, followed by my boss, Dr. Calloway, listing my qualifications like a battle report. And the ultimate proof, my mother's own advance directive, found minutes earlier, explicitly excluding me, her trauma surgeon daughter, from her medical decisions out of mercy. All unfolded within a single, brutal afternoon. My mother, Lorraine, was still clutching a pamphlet on hand hygiene, oblivious, when the truth hit her like a tidal wave. Before I tell you what happened next, if you enjoy stories about justice and family boundaries, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Drop a comment and let me know. The night before the lake party, I worked a 16-hour shift. 3 surgeries back-to-back. A car wreck on Chapman Highway, a stabbing outside a bar on Cumberland Avenue, and a motorcycle kid who hit a guardrail at 70 and came in with his femur in 2 pieces. That last one was touch and go for 40 minutes. I had my hands inside his abdomen clamping a bleeder I couldn't see while the anesthesiologist counted down his pressure. He stabilized at 2 o'clock in the morning. Walked out of the hospital 11 days later with a titanium rod and a story he'd tell for the rest of his life. I went back to the call room, sat on the edge of the cot, and peeled off surgical gloves that had gone stiff with dried betadine. My wrists smelled like iodine. They always did. Donna, the night shift charge nurse, stuck her head in on her way past. She'd been running trauma base since before I started medical school. "Briggs, go home. You look like you lost a fight with a cement mixer." I told her I had one more set of notes to finish. She shook her head. "If Briggs is on, I sleep better. But even Briggs needs a bed." She left a cup of black coffee on the counter. It was cold by the time I got to it. I drank it anyway, typed my surgical notes at the workstation with one hand, and scrolled through my phone with the other. A text from my brother, Grant. "Lake house party Saturday. Whole family. Bring a swimsuit." I stared at that text for a long time. At work, people called me Dr. Briggs. They trusted me with their worst moments. At home, things worked differently. I grew up in Maryville, Tennessee, 20 minutes south of Knoxville. Close enough to see the Smokies from the backyard. Small enough that everyone knew your father poured their neighbor's foundation. My dad, Dale Briggs, ran a construction outfit. 3 trucks, a dozen guys, honest work, early mornings. My mom, Lorraine, kept the house, ran the church bake sale, and had opinions about everything except her own ambitions. My brother, Grant, was 4 years older, built like a linebacker, and destined from birth to take over the family business. Nobody ever said it out loud. They didn't have to. The dinner table had 2 chairs that mattered, and they both faced Grant's direction. I was the quiet one. The one who read anatomy textbooks in the back seat during football games. When I got a full scholarship to UT's pre-med program, my mother's first response was, "For more years." Then, "How many more after that? When are you planning on coming home?" I told her straight, "I'm building something, Mom." She changed the subject to Grant's new truck. The pattern started early and calcified fast. My second year of medical school, I called home on a Sunday. Lorraine had me on speakerphone. I could hear dishes, the TV, Dale coughing. A neighbor stopped by. Lorraine said, bright as Sunday morning, "Oh, Piper? She helps out at a clinic somewhere." I said, loud enough for the room, "I'm in medical school, Mom. I dissected a cadaver last Tuesday." Lorraine laughed. "Oh, you know what I mean." I did know what she meant. She meant she'd already decided what I was, and the facts were not invited to the conversation. That was the first time I heard her reshape me. It would not be the last. I fought back. "I want that clear. I was never the kind of woman who swallowed the insult and smiled. The first year of residency, I mailed home a framed copy of my medical school diploma, Doctor of Medicine, University of Tennessee, summa laude. Packed it myself. Insured it. 6 weeks later, I drove down to visit and looked for it on the wall. Not in the hallway, not in the living room, not in the den next to Grant's contractor's license and his framed photo shaking hands with a county supervisor. I opened the hall closet. My diploma was leaning against the vacuum cleaner, still in the bubble wrap. I pulled it out and set it on the kitchen table. Where should this go? Lorraine dried her hands on a towel. Oh, honey, I just haven't found the right spot. I pointed at the wall behind the couch where Grant's certificates hung in a neat row. Right there seems to work fine for Grant. She changed the subject to pot roast. The second time, I invited the whole family to my residency completion ceremony in Knoxville, 45 minutes away. Dale said he had a concrete pour that week. Lorraine said the drive was too much. I stood in the hospital auditorium and accepted my certificate next to colleagues whose families filled 3 rows. Dr. Calloway, the ER chief, took the photo for me. The third time, I called home the day I passed my board certification. Lorraine picked up. I said, "Mom, I'm a board-certified trauma surgeon." She said, "Oh, that's nice, honey. Grant just signed a contract for a 32-house subdivision. Did he tell you?" I said, "Mom, I'm a surgeon, not a nurse, not an aide." She said, "Playing nurse, playing doctor. What's the difference? You're still up at that hospital all hours." That was the last time I corrected her. Not because I gave up, because I redirected my energy to the people who actually needed it, the ones bleeding on my table at 3 a.m. Grant's lake house invitation sat in my phone for 2 days. I almost declined. I had a shift swap I could have taken, Saturday overnight, 14 hours, easy excuse. Nobody in that family would have questioned it. But on Thursday evening, my phone buzzed again. It wasn't Grant this time. "Coo, Piper." Colton's voice, 5 years old and incapable of whispering. "Daddy says you're maybe coming to the lake. Are you coming? I learned to swim. I can float on my back and everything. I want to show you." Behind him, I could hear Kristen, Grant's wife, prompting, "Say please, Colton. Please." I leaned against my kitchen counter. My apartment was quiet. It was always quiet. One reading chair, a stack of surgical journals, a pothose vine on the shelf above the stove that somehow survived on neglect and fluorescent light. Colton was the only person in that family who never needed me to be anything other than his aunt. He didn't care about diplomas or job titles. He just wanted me to watch him float. "I'll be there, buddy. Save me a spot on the dock." I called in my shift swap. On Friday night, I packed a bag. Shorts, tank top, sunscreen. Then, out of habit, I grabbed the small emergency kit I kept in my car. Gauze, tape, a pocket CPR mask, a pen light. Trauma surgeons carry things. It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition. You see enough emergencies start in ordinary places, and you stop assuming anywhere is safe. I also tossed in a child's life vest, the kind with the buckle across the chest. Grant had mentioned Colton took swimming lessons. Swimming lessons are not the same as open water. I clipped my hospital badge to my bag, without thinking. I'd driven straight from my last shift. Some things you carry everywhere. I pulled into the gravel driveway at 11:15 on Saturday morning. Grant's new lake house sat on a sloped lot above Norris Lake, a brown A-frame with a wraparound porch, a dock jutting into green water, and a yard that smelled like fresh-cut grass and charcoal. Tennessee July, 92 degrees by noon, humidity you could chew. A Bluetooth speaker on the porch rail played something by Zac Brown Band. Cars lined the drive, Dale's pickup, Lorraine's sedan, a handful of SUVs I didn't recognize. Grant had invited half of Maryville. I flung my bag over my shoulder and walked up the porch steps. Lorraine stood in the center of a knot of guests, women from her church circle, a couple I vaguely recognized from the neighborhood. She saw me and waved with the arm that wasn't holding sweet tea. "Oh, there she is. Everyone, this is my daughter. She works up at the hospital." A woman in a floral blouse smiled. "Oh, a nurse? That's lovely." Lorraine did not correct her. She turned her smile up a notch. She's always been a helper. I set my bag down, looked the woman in the floral blouse in the eye. I'm a surgeon, actually. Trauma surgery. I work in the emergency department. The woman's eyebrows went up.
Oh.
Lorraine was already steering the conversation toward the potato salad. The woman nodded politely at me, then followed Lorraine to the food table. I stood on the porch with my bag at my feet. I'd said the words. I always said the words. The problem was never my silence. The problem was that no one in this family held on to the answer once I gave it. Kristen came out of the kitchen carrying a tray of deviled eggs like she was presenting a trophy. She hugged me with one arm, the kind of hug that keeps you at a distance while pretending closeness. Piper, you made it. We honestly didn't think you'd show. You're always so busy with your little job. I took a deviled egg off the tray. Trauma surgery is a lot of things, Kristen. Little isn't one of them. She laughed, the way people laugh when they've already decided not to hear you. Can you help me carry the cooler from the truck? You look strong. I carried the cooler. I wasn't going to fight about a cooler. I had bigger things to measure my anger against. On the porch, Dale sat in an Adirondack chair with a can of Bud Light, holding court with two men I recognized as his old crew foreman. He was mid-story, something about Grant's crew pouring a foundation in record time. 40 yards of concrete in a single day. That boy works harder than anyone I know. I walked past. Dale looked up. Hey, Pip. That was it. No question about work. No question about anything. I found Colton by the dock. He was crouched at the edge poking a stick into the water watching minnows scatter. The second he saw me, he launched.
Coo, Piper.
Arms around my legs. I scooped him up. Show me this swimming you've been bragging about. He wiggled free and pointed at the water. Watch. I looked at the dock. No railing on the deep side. No life ring mounted anywhere. Water turned dark green 3 feet from the edge. Deep drop-off. I called to Grant across the yard. Where's the life ring for this dock? He waved his burger. It's a lake, Pip, not an operating room. I left the child's life vest on the dock railing. Some habits save lives. More guests arrived around noon. Pastor Holt and his wife, Darlene, pulled up in a clean white Buick. Lorraine greeted them at the porch steps like visiting royalty. Handshake for the pastor.
Tea kiss for Darlene.
The whole production. She walked them through the party introducing family. Dale got, my husband, 38 years. Grant got, our son, runs the family business. You should see the towns and development he's building. Kristen got, the best daughter-in-law a mother could ask for. Then Lorraine reached me. I was standing by the drink table pouring lemonade for Colton. And this is Piper. She put her hand on my shoulder.
Squeezed.
She's our babysitter. She's so good with Colton. She laughed. Light and easy. Like it was a charming little joke that everyone was in on. Darlene smiled. I did not. I'm not the babysitter, Mom. I'm a surgeon. Lorraine kept her smile locked in place. Oh, she's always so serious. You know how kids these days are. They all think they're saving the world. Darlene glanced at me, something that might have been curiosity or pity. Lorraine was already steering her toward the dessert table. I stayed by the drinks. Colton tugged my hand. Who, Piper? Why'd Grandma call you the babysitter? I looked down at him. Honest kid. Honest question. Because Grandma sometimes forgets what I do for work, buddy. He frowned. But you're a doctor.
Yeah.
I handed him his lemonade. I am. The progression was clear now, and I tracked it the way I'd track a patient's declining vitals. First visit, she helps out at the hospital. Next introduction, she's sort of a nurse. Now, she's the babysitter. Each time a little further from the truth. Each time, a little harder to correct without making a scene at someone else's party. In the early afternoon, with the sun high and the air thick enough to lean against, I sat down next to Dale on the porch. He was on his third beer. The foreman had drifted off to the food table, and for a rare minute, it was just the two of us. I tried. That's what I want you to understand. I kept trying, even when the return on effort was zero. Dad, I had a tough case last week. 16-year-old kid. Motorcycle wreck. Came in with a ruptured spleen and a collapsed lung. We worked on him for 4 hours. Dale nodded slowly, the way he nodded at weather reports. That's good, Pip. Glad you could help. Then, without transition, Grant poured the Townsend Foundation himself? 40 yards. One day. That boy is something else. I let a beat pass. I opened a teenager's chest in the back of an ambulance last month. Dad. Clamped a bleeding artery with my fingers while the rig was still moving. Dale looked at me. Really looked. For maybe 2 seconds. Well, that sounds intense. You be careful up there. Up there, like the hospital was a distant country, a place he'd heard of but never visited, never intended to visit, and couldn't quite locate on a map. He wasn't cruel. I need you to know that, too. Dale Briggs was a man who understood the world in terms of what his hands could build. Walls, foundations, porches like the one we sat on. My world existed chest cavities and fluorescent-lit bays, and it was as foreign to him as the inside of a submarine. He loved me the way you love a language you never learned, with good intentions and no comprehension. It still hurt. Love without seeing always does. Lunch was served on folding tables under a canvas canopy Grant had rigged between 2 oaks, burgers, coleslaw, baked beans, corn on the cob, and a sheet cake that said Briggs Lake House in blue icing. Kristen ran the operation like a field general, directing guests to seats, organizing condiments, making sure the Instagram angles were right. I was cutting watermelon slices for Colton at the kids' table when Kristen leaned over my shoulder, loud enough for the adjacent table to hear. Piper, you're such a natural with kids. Seriously, if the hospital thing doesn't work out, you could totally open a daycare. I didn't look up. The knife kept moving through the melon, clean and even. The hospital thing is working out fine, Kristen. I removed a man's spleen 2 days ago. Kristen wrinkled her nose. EW. Can we maybe not talk about organs at lunch? Lorraine, seated nearby, nodded. She's right, Piper. Nobody wants to hear about blood at a cookout. I set down the knife, wiped my hands, looked at Kristen, then Lorraine. You asked about my work. I told you about my work. If you don't want the answer, don't open the door. The table got quiet for a moment. Then Kristen turned to Grant with something about the dock lights, and the moment was papered over like it never happened. Grant sat 2 seats away. He'd heard everything. He kept eating his burger.
Didn't offend me.
Didn't deny what I'd said. Just chewed and stared at the lake. I watched him and filed it where I file every piece of data that confirms what I already know. Grant understood the truth about my career. He just found silence more comfortable than confrontation. He'd been making that trade his whole life. After lunch, the adults gathered on the grass between the house and the dock. Grant brought out a cooler of cold beer, and Dale stood up with a can raised like it was a gavel. He cleared his throat the way men of his generation clear their throats before saying something they consider important. I want to say a few words. This lake house, this is what the Briggs family is about. Hard work, real work, things you can stand on and point to and say, I built that. Grandson, you took this family business and turned it into something your grandfather would have been proud of. This place is proof. He lifted his beer higher. To Grant.
To Kristen.
To this family that builds real things. Lorraine raised her glass of sweet tea. And to Kristen, the best daughter-in-law anyone could ask for.
We are so blessed.
Applause. Murmurs of agreement. 15 people clinking cups and cans. Nobody looked at me. I stood at the edge of the group with a glass of water, and I could have been a piece of lawn furniture. I waited for Dale to finish. Then I said it. Not shouting. Not whispering. Just clear, flat, and aimed directly at him. I build things too, Dad. They just happen to be inside people. He heard me. I know he heard me because his jaw shifted the way it does when he's deciding whether to engage or retreat. He chose retreat. Turned back to the group and started a second toast about the quality of the dockwood. I drained my water, set the glass on the table, and walked down to the dock.
Colton followed me.
We sat with our feet in the water, and he leaned against my arm.
Cool, Piper.
How come you look mad? I'm not mad, buddy. Just thinking. About doctor stuff?
Yeah.
About doctor stuff. That conversation on the dock was the last quiet moment of the afternoon. Darlene found me on the dock 20 minutes later. She'd kicked off her sandals and walked barefoot across the warm wood, holding a plate of sheet cake she hadn't touched. She sat down beside me with the careful grace of a woman used to sitting next to people in crisis. "Pastor's wife instincts. Your mother tells me you work at the hospital,"
she said gently.
"A nurse?" I looked at the water. Then I looked at her.
"No.
"I'm an attending trauma surgeon. Board certified. 2 years. I specialize in penetrating trauma and emergency surgery. If someone in this county gets shot or hit by a car or falls off a roof, there's a good chance I'm the one cutting them open at 3 o'clock in the morning." Darlene's fork paused halfway to the cake. "Your mother didn't mention any of that." "She never does." Darlene set the plate down. "That's Piper. That's remarkable." "Why would she? That's a question you'd have to ask her." I wasn't going to perform my mother's psychology for a woman I'd met an hour ago, but I also wasn't going to sit on a dock at my brother's party and let one more person walk away thinking I hand out bandages for a living. I just want one person at this party to know what I actually do. I said. "Now you do." Darlene nodded. She excused herself, walked back up the slope toward the canopy, and I watched her lean close to Lorraine and say something I couldn't hear. Lorraine's face tightened. She glanced across the yard at me. A quick, sharp look, like a card player who just realized someone else can see her hand. She didn't come to the dock. She just smiled wider at the next guest and poured more sweet tea. I turned back to the water. Somewhere behind me, the truth was circulating without my help. "I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who are supposed to know you best and realized they'd already written a story about you that had nothing to do with the truth? If that hits close, drop a comment below.
Tell me about it.
And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Because what happened next at that lake changed everything." I went inside to use the bathroom. The lake house was cool and dim after the glare outside, and I stood in the hallway for a moment just breathing air that didn't taste like sunscreen and charcoal smoke. On the kitchen counter, next to a bowl of car keys and a stack of napkins, there was a manila folder. The tab read "Important Documents, Lorraine B." I shouldn't have opened it, but my name was visible on the second page, poking out from under a property deed. And when you see your own name on a legal document you didn't sign, you look. It was an advance healthcare directive, Lorraine's, dated 3 months earlier, notarized. The kind of document people fill out when they start thinking about what happens when they can't speak for themselves anymore. I read it standing up, one hand on the counter, with the same focus I bring to a surgical chart. Section 1, Preferred Medical Decision Maker, Grant Briggs. Section 2, Physician to Consult, Dr. Raymond Hess, Family Medicine, Maryville. Section 3, Additional Notes. And here, in Lorraine's handwriting, shaky but legible, a single line. "Do not burden Piper with these decisions. She has given enough of her life to that hospital. Let her rest." I read it twice. I read it a third time. My mother had filled out a legal document about her own death, and she had specifically excluded her daughter. The trauma surgeon, the board-certified physician, the person in this family most qualified to make medical decisions under pressure, and her reason was mercy.
She thought she was protecting me.
I could see it. Lorraine at 14, waiting for her own mother to come to the school play. Her mother the midwife, out on a dirt road in the winter dark, delivering someone else's baby. Her mother, who never came home from work one night because her heart gave out behind the wheel. Lorraine's fear had a face. It looked like mine. But understanding where a wound comes from doesn't make it bleed less. I closed the folder, put it back exactly where I found it, walked outside into the Tennessee heat. That document sat in my chest like a second heartbeat for the rest of the afternoon. I came back to the party and acted like nothing had shifted. This is what I do. In the OR, when a patient's vitals start sliding and the resident next to you is wide-eyed with panic, you don't match their energy. You go quieter, steadier. You compartmentalize the crisis into a sequence of tasks, and you execute them one at a time until the bleeding stops. I applied the same discipline to my mother's advance directive.
Not now.
Not here. I watched Lorraine circulate among the guests, refilling glasses, laughing with Darlene as though the whispered correction on the dock had never happened. I watched Dale telling the concrete pour story for the third time. I watched Kristen angle her phone for a group photo, arranging people by some invisible hierarchy that placed Grant in the center and me at the edge of the frame. "Lake life with a fan," she announced and posted it before anyone could blink. I sat on the dock steps and let the sun press against my shoulders. The water lapped at the pilings with a rhythm that should have been soothing, but instead sounded like counting. I was not going to confront Lorraine here about that document. The decision was strategic, not timid. Colton was splashing in the shallows 10 feet away. This was his day, too. His father's lake house, his first summer of swimming. A 5-year-old's whole universe concentrated in green water and cake icing. I would not detonate the afternoon for a confrontation that could happen on my terms on my timeline, in a setting I controlled. I'd learned that much from the operating room. The moment you lose control of the timing, you lose the patient. And I was not ready to operate on this family yet. Colton climbed out of the shallows and ran to me, dripping, teeth chattering despite the heat. I wrapped him in a towel from my bag and rubbed his arms until the shivering stopped. He burrowed against my side like a wet puppy. "Coo, Piper, did you see me?" I swam all the way to the orange buoy. "I saw, buddy. You're getting fast." He tipped his head back and looked at me with his father's brown eyes. "When I grow up, I want to be a doctor, like you." I stopped rubbing his arms. "You know I'm a doctor." He squinted at me like I'd asked something obvious.
"Yeah, Daddy told me."
"You fix people when they're really hurt, like in the movies, but real." I looked across the yard. Grant stood by the grill flipping something. He must have felt my eyes because he glanced over. For 1 second we held each other's gaze. And then he looked away, back to the coals, back to the safe world of burgers and dogwood and Dad's approval. So Grant knew. Of course Grant knew. He'd always known. He told his own son the truth about me while standing in a house where his parents told everyone a lie. He just never found the courage to correct them because correcting Lorraine meant a fight. And Grant had spent 37 years choosing the path that kept the peace. I looked down at Colton. "You can be whatever you want, buddy. Doctor, builder, astronaut, anything. And I'll be there when you figure it out." He grinned and squirmed free to run back toward the water. I watched him go. He was the reason I kept showing up. He was also the reason what happened next tour threw me the way it did. By 3 o'clock the afternoon had settled into the lazy loose-limbed stage where adults stopped paying attention. The cooler was half empty. Dale dozed in the Adirondack chair with his hat over his face. Lorraine and Darlene were deep in conversation on the porch. Voices low, heads close. Kristen was inside probably editing that photo she'd posted. Grant and 2 of his buddies had walked up the slope to look at a retaining wall he was planning to build behind the house. The kids, Colton and 2 neighbor children, maybe 7 and 9, were in the water near the dock. No adult within arm's reach. I'd moved the child life vest from the dock railing to the edge of the planking, closer to the water. Colton hadn't put it on. I'd asked him twice. The second time I knelt down, held the vest open and said, "Arms in, buddy." Grant called from the slope. "He's fine, Piper. He can touch the bottom." I looked at the water near the buoy. He could not touch the bottom there. I said, "Grant, past that buoy it drops off." Grant waved me off the way he waved off building inspectors. He knows not to go out that far. I set the vest on the dock rail where Colton could reach it. Then I stayed on the dock, feet in the water, eyes on the kids. The sun was lower now, angling through the trees on the far shore, and the lake surface had shifted from bright green to something darker, harder to read. Shadows stretched across the water like reaching hands. The dock creaked under me when I shifted my weight. The neighbor kids were dunking each other near the ladder, shrieking and splashing. Colton drifted farther out toward the orange buoy he'd been so proud of reaching earlier. He was treading water. Then he was bobbing. Then he was reaching for the buoy chain, and missing. 7 adults within 50 feet of that water. Not one of them was watching the children. I was. I'd never stopped watching. Some instincts don't have an off switch. And mine had been sharpened on a decade of reading situations that turn lethal in the space between one breath and the next. Sound carries over water. I learned that in anatomy, actually. The physics of wave propagation across a flat surface, minimum interference, maximum reach. So when Lorraine's voice drifted from the porch to the dock, I heard every syllable as clearly as if she were standing next to me. She was talking to Darlene and another woman I didn't recognize. Someone's cousin, maybe, or a friend of Kristen's. Oh, Piper? She answers phones at the hospital, I think. Or maybe she hands out bandages. I can never quite keep track. You know how these young people are. They change jobs every other month. She said it lightly, casually, the way you describe a distant acquaintance whose name you keep forgetting. Not your daughter. Not the person whose diploma sat unopened in your closet for a year. This was worse than nurse. Worse than babysitter. This was erasure. A full, deliberate wipe, reducing 7 years of surgical training and 1,000 nights in the trauma bay to answering phones. I turned on the dock, jaw tight, and opened my mouth to then I saw Colton, face down, arms slack at his sides, 15 feet from the dock, past the drop-off where the green water turned black. Not splashing, not calling out, just floating, motionless, hair spread on the surface like lake grass. The neighbor kids were 20 foot behind him at the ladder, oblivious, still shrieking and splashing each other. Everything else, Lorraine's voice, the music, the clinking of bottles, dropped out of my hearing like someone had pulled the plug on a speaker. There was the boy. There was the water. And there was what I do. I kicked off my sandals and hit the water in 2 strides off the edge of the dock. The lake was colder than I expected. That Tennessee thermocline, warm on top and frigid underneath, and my legs plunged through both layers as I swam. 15 feet, I reached him in seconds. I flipped Colton face up with one arm and cradled his head against my shoulder. His lips were blue. His eyes were closed. His chest was not moving. I swam back to the dock with one arm pulling and one arm keeping his head above water. The wood scraped my forearm when I hauled him onto the planking. I didn't feel it. I tilted his head back, opened his airway, and put my ear to his mouth.
No breath.
No movement. I reached for the protocol that lives in my hands the way music lives in a pianist's fingers. 2 rescue breaths first. That's the difference with drowning. It's a respiratory arrest, not cardiac. You lead with air, not compressions. I sealed my mouth over his, pinched his nose, and breathed. His small chest rose. I breathed again. His chest rose again.
No cough.
No response. I shifted to compressions. One hand on his sternum because he was 5 and his ribs were thin as balsa wood, and I had to calculate the force to compress without fracturing. 30 pushes, hard and fast, counting in my head. Then 2 more breaths. Behind me, the world was catching up. Kristen screamed. A plate shattered. Grant's voice raw. Colton. Colton. Running feet on the dock boards, heavy, panicked, shaking the whole structure. I did not look up. I did not stop. I put my mouth on my nephew's face and breathed for him again. 30 more compressions. My hands did not shake. They have never shaken. Not during a 4-hour surgery on a gunshot wound. Not during a field resuscitation in the back of an ambulance on a rain-slicked highway. And not now, with Colton's heartbeat under my palm. Faint but fighting. On the 3rd cycle, Colton coughed. Lake water surged up and out of him, a thin greenish stream that splashed across the dock boards. Then another cough, deeper, wetter. And his body convulsed under my hands. I rolled him onto his side. Recovery position. He retched twice. Coughed again, and then the sound I'd been waiting for, a ragged, gasping inhale. Breathing.
Crying. Alive.
I held him on his side, and checked his pulse at the brachial artery, inside his upper arm, the pediatric checkpoint. Heart rate elevated, maybe 140, but steady and strong. His oxygen levels would need monitoring, but his color was already coming back. Blue lips fading to pink. I looked up for the first time. Grant was on his knees at the edge of the dock, white as the sheet cake. His hands were reaching for his son, but trembling too badly to hold anything. Kristen stood behind him, both hands pressed over her mouth, mascara tracking down her cheeks. Dale had frozen halfway down the slope, beer can still in his right hand, as though his brain had stopped mid-step and forgotten to tell his body. Lorraine stood at the top of the yard with both hands covering her face. I lifted Colton and placed him gently in Grant's arms. Keep him on his side. If he vomits again, let it come out. Don't lay him on his back. Grant clutched his son. Piper, someone needs to call 911. Tell them you have a pediatric drowning. Patient responsive, needs emergency assessment. Tell them we'll meet the ambulance at the top of the driveway. I was not asking. I was directing. The same voice I use at 3 o'clock in the morning when a trauma comes through the double doors, and every second is a negotiation with death. The doc went silent. For the first time in my life, my family did exactly what I told them. The ambulance arrived in 14 minutes. 2 paramedics jogged down the slope with a pediatric kit and a portable monitor. The lead paramedic, a stocky guy in his 40s with a shaved head and calm hands, knelt beside Colton and ran through vitals. Pulse ox, 91 and climbing. Respiratory rate, 22. No signs of aspiration. He shone a penlight in Colton's eyes. Reactive, equal. He turned to me. Who initiated CPR? I did, I said. 2 rescue breaths first, then 30 compressions. He responded on the 3rd cycle. Submersion was under 2 minutes. Total CPR approximately 90 seconds. He studied me the way medical people study each other, reading competence in the vocabulary. You're medical. Trauma surgeon, UT Medical Center. He nodded once. The nod of recognition, not surprise. Your field save gave this kid the best possible outcome. Textbook ventilation first. We'll transport for observation, but based on what I'm seeing, you bought him a full recovery. Grant stood beside the stretcher, holding Colton's hand. Kristen stood behind Grant, arms wrapped around herself. Dale had finally made it to the bottom of the slope, beer can abandoned somewhere on the grass. They all heard every word. Lorraine, standing at the back of the group, spoke first. Well, anyone would have known to do that. The paramedic didn't turn around. He was strapping Colton to the stretcher, adjusting the child-sized oxygen mask, but his voice carried. Ma'am, 90% of bystanders freeze during a pediatric drowning. What she did is not anyone. That's trained response. The silence after that sentence lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Colton, sleepy under the oxygen mask, reached for me. Cooper, you're coming, right? I'm right behind you, buddy. They transported Colton to UT Medical Center in Knoxville, the closest level 1 trauma center, my hospital. I drove behind the ambulance in my own car, still in lake clothes, damp shorts, tank top, hair stiff with dried lake water. No scrubs, no white coat, no stethoscope around my neck. My hospital badge was buried in my bag under a wet towel. Grant rode in the ambulance with Colton. Kristen drove with Dale and Lorraine. Darlene came, too. For support, she said. But I think she wanted to see how the rest of this played out. We gathered in the ER waiting room, the same waiting room I walked past 100 times a week on my way to the trauma bay. The same chairs I'd seen families collapse into after I told them their person was going to be okay, or that I'd done everything I could. Now I sat in one of those chairs, and the fluorescent lights buzzed the same, and the linoleum smelled the same, and I was on the wrong side of the doors. Colton was taken to pediatric assessment. Grant paced. Kristen gripped her phone so tightly, I could see her knuckles from across the room. Dale sat rigid, staring straight ahead like a man who'd been dropped into a country where he didn't speak the language. A nurse walked past the waiting area, clipboard in hand. She glanced through the glass partition, slowed, and looked again. I recognized her, Maria from the night shift. She recognized me. Dr. Briggs? She stopped walking. Is that you? I didn't see you on the schedule. Are you on shift? I shook my head slightly and mouthed, not now. She held my eyes for a beat, nodded, and moved on. Grant stared at me from across the room. Did she just call our doctor? That's what people at my workplace call me, Grant. Waiting room's compress time. 5 minutes feels like 30. Lorraine filled the silence the way she fills every silence with narrative. She was talking to Darlene loud enough for the room to absorb, constructing a version of the afternoon that would fit inside her world. It happened so fast. 1 minute he was swimming, the next honestly I thank God that Grant got to him when he did. I was sitting 3 chairs away. I got to him, Mom. Not Grant. She adjusted without missing a beat. Well, yes. You were in the water, too. You helped. But the ambulance people said anyone could have done. The paramedics said the opposite. You were standing right there when he said it. Her fingers tightened on the strap of her purse. I'm just saying, let's not make this about who did what. The important thing is Colton is okay. I leaned forward. You're right. The important thing is Colton is okay. So maybe stop telling people a version of today where I wasn't the reason for that. The waiting room had that particular quality of silence that happens when everyone is listening and nobody wants to admit it. Kristen studied her fingernails. Dale cleared his throat. Darlene looked at the floor. Lorraine smoothed her skirt. One long, deliberate stroke. And turned her face toward the wall.
She didn't argue.
She didn't apologize. She just stopped talking. Which for Lorraine was the nearest thing to surrender I'd ever witnessed. I sat back in my chair. She could rewrite a decade of my career. She'd proven that with every church potluck and neighborhood introduction. But she could not rewrite something 20 people watched happen 2 hours ago. And the distance between those two facts was closing fast. Grant found me in the hallway 5 minutes later. His face was wrecked. The kind of face you see on parents in the ER when the adrenaline is wearing off and the magnitude of what almost happened is settling in like concrete. He stood in front of me and opened his mouth twice before sound came out. Piper, if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't, but I was there. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. I should have listened about the life vest. I should have been watching the water. I was looking at a retaining wall while my son was yes. You should have been watching. He flinched. I didn't soften it. Some truths need their full weight. And I should have for years, Piper.
I should have said something.
To Mom and Dad. About what you do. About who you are. I told Colton, but I never widened you. He looked at me with his father's eyes and his father's habit of retreat. Because it was easier. Because as long as they were focused on building me up, I didn't have to fight them about tearing you down. I let that sit. He'd said it plainly, and there was a kind of courage in the admission, even if it was years overdue.
I don't need you to be sorry, Grant.
I need you to stop being comfortable with their version of me. He nodded.
Slowly.
The way a man nods when he knows the bill has come due, and there's no one else to pay it. I spent 10 years proving myself to people who are not paying attention. I saved strangers every shift and came home to a family that introduced me as the babysitter. But what happened next in that waiting room? A single word from one person directed at me like it was the most ordinary thing in the world did what 10 years of correcting and explaining never could. Stay with me. And snorts. If someone you love has ever been diminished by their own family, share this story with them. I walked back into the waiting room and sat down. The fluorescent lights hummed. A vending machine in the corner cycled with a low mechanical groan. Lorraine was staring at a pamphlet about hand hygiene like it contained the secrets of the universe. Then, the double doors at the end of the corridor swung open. Dr. Rebecca Calloway, silver-haired, 5'10", white coat starched to a crease you could cut paper on, strode through with a resident half jogging at her elbow. She was mid-sentence about a chart review, already scanning the waiting room the way she scanned every room, quick, comprehensive, diagnostic. Her eyes swept past the vending machine, past Dale, past Lorraine, past Grant standing at the window, and landed on me.
She stopped.
The resident, still talking, bumped into her shoulder. Calloway didn't notice. She cocked her head the way she does in the trauma bay when something doesn't track. When the labs say one thing, and the patient says another. Then she walked straight across the waiting room, white coat swinging, stethoscope tapping against her chest with each stride, and stopped in front of my chair.
Dr. Briggs.
She said it the way she always says it, professional, matter of fact, the way you'd say good morning to someone you see every day. But in this room, in this context, surrounded by these people, those two words hit the air like a flare over dark water. Lorraine's head snapped up from the pamphlet. Dale's hand tightened on the armrest. Kristen went still. Grant turned from the window. Calloway, oblivious to the detonation she'd just triggered, continued. Why are you sitting out here? If your family's back there, I can walk you through myself. Let me check with the care team. I'm here with family, I said. My nephew was the drowning case brought in about an hour ago. Calloway's expression shifted. Your nephew?
She paused.
The field CPR on that case was textbook.
Wait.
She looked at me. That was you. I nodded.
Of course it was, she said.
Calloway turned to the room. She was not performing. She was not making a speech. She was simply filling in context the way doctors do when they realize someone's chart is missing a page. You must be incredibly proud, she said, addressing the cluster of family members like colleagues at a briefing. Piper is one of the strongest trauma surgeons on our team. The field save she performed today, ventilation-first CPR on a pediatric drowning victim in open water, without equipment. That's a skill set most ER physicians would struggle with outside hospital walls. She said it like she was reading vitals off a monitor. Factual. Obvious. Not praise. Inventory. Lorraine's mouth opened. Nothing came out. She tried again. Yes, of course we know she works here. Calloway tilted her head. That diagnostic tilt again. Works here? She doesn't work here, ma'am. She's an attending surgeon. Board certified in trauma. She ran our trauma-based solo last month during the Route 33 pileup. 9 patients, 0 losses. I submitted her name for the regional surgical commendation last quarter. She let that land. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, she's also being considered for deputy chief of trauma surgery next fiscal year. But you probably already know all that. The silence that followed had weight. It pressed against the walls of that waiting room like barometric pressure before a storm. Darlene looked at Lorraine. Lorraine looked at the linoleum. Dale looked at his hands. Kristen's lips were parted, frozen. Grant had closed his eyes. Calloway sensed the atmospheric shift. She glanced between me and my family, her brow furrowing. Did I interrupt something?
No, I said.
You said exactly what needed to be said. Calloway, still puzzled, tried once more.
I'm sorry.
I assumed you all knew this. What did you think she did here? Lorraine could not answer. I answered for her, quietly, without heat. She thinks I play nurse. Calloway looked at me, then at Lorraine, then back at me. A single expression crossed her face, something between disbelief and the particular sorrow that comes from suddenly understanding a colleague's private weight.
She didn't comment. She didn't need to.
She touched my arm once, briefly, and said, I'll check on your nephew personally. He's in good hands. Then she walked back through the double doors, and the waiting room belonged to us. Lorraine stood up. Her composure was fracturing from the inside out. You could see it in the way her hands shook, the way her voice climbed half an octave. Now wait. I have always told people she worked at the hospital. Always. I've always been supportive. I don't understand why she's making this sound like Darlene, quiet as a hymn. Lorraine, you told me she hands out bandages 2 hours ago on that dock. I said no such thing. And you told me she answers phones, added the cousin friend from the porch, who had ridden along and was now seated in the far corner clutching her own purse. Lorraine spun toward me. Her eyes were wet. You don't understand. I was trying to your grandmother, she stopped. The sentence stalled at the edge of something she'd spent 48 years avoiding. I waited. I gave her the silence a surgeon gives a patient before delivering a diagnosis. Not rushing. Not retreating. Just steady. She couldn't finish it. So I did. I know about Grandma Rose, Mom. I know you were 14. I know she died on a back road coming home from a delivery and you were waiting at the school for a play she never saw. I know you're terrified that what happened to her is happening to me. Lorraine sat down. Hard. Like her legs had made the decision without her. Dale reached for Lorraine's hand. She let him take it. His face had the collapsed quality of a man who just realized he'd been standing in the wrong room for a very long time. But Mom, I continued, and my voice did not rise. Instead of telling me you were afraid, you told everyone I was a receptionist. Instead of asking me about my work, you erased it. You didn't protect me from medicine. You protected yourself from having to admit I chose it, and I'm good at it.
She didn't speak.
Her free hand pressed flat against her thigh, fingers splayed the way people brace themselves when the ground shifts. Dale cleared his throat.
Pip.
He looked at Lorraine. At me. At the floor. I should have come to your ceremonies. I told myself you didn't need us there. I was wrong. I nodded. It was not enough. But it was the first honest thing he'd said to me in years, and I wasn't going to punish honesty with silence. You don't owe me an apology right now, I said. You owe me the truth. Next time someone asks what your daughter does, you tell them. Not your version.
Mean.
Grant from the corner. I'll make sure of it. I looked at Lorraine. I love you, Mom, but I will not let you teach Colton that what I do doesn't count. He already knows what I am. He's the only person in this family who's been proud of it out loud. Lorraine flinched. That landed. They'd all known. Every single one of them. They just chose a story that was easier to tell. Calloway came back 20 minutes later with an update. Colton's chest X-ray was clear.
Lungstons normal bilaterali.
Oxygen saturation at 98%. No signs of aspiration pneumonia. They'd keep him overnight for observation. Standard protocol for pediatric submersion. But she expected a full recovery. He's asking for his aunt, Calloway added, looking at me with a small smile. We filed into the pediatric room. Colton was propped up on pillows, an oxygen cannula draped across his cheeks, looking smaller than usual against the white hospital sheets. His eyes found me, before anyone else. Cooper, I sat on the edge of his bed.
She's right, buddy.
You're tough.
He yawned.
The enormous jaw-cracking yawn of a 5-year-old whose body was demanding sleep after the most frightening hour of his young life. She said somebody did really good CPR on me. His eyes were drooping. Was it you? Yeah, buddy. It was me. He smiled, already half asleep. I knew it. Because you're a doctor. I pressed my lips to his forehead. His skin was warm. His heartbeat was steady under the thin hospital gown. Go to sleep, Colton. His eyes closed. I sat there for another minute, feeling his pulse through the mattress, counting it out of habit. When I finally looked up, Lorraine was standing in the doorway. No audience, no church friends, no narrative to manage. Just a mother watching a daughter she'd never figured out how to see.
We didn't speak.
Some things need more time than a waiting room can give. The following week played out in fragments. Grant called me on Tuesday. He'd gone to a frame shop in Maryville and had 2 pieces mounted, my medical school diploma and my board certification. He hung them in his office at Briggs Construction on the wall behind his desk, next to his contractor's license. I should have done this years ago.
He said.
Yes. I said. You should have. There was silence on the line. Not the uncomfortable silence of avoidance. The honest silence of a man sitting with the weight of what he'd allowed. Dale left me a voicemail on Wednesday evening. 2 minutes long. Mostly dead air. I could hear him breathing, starting sentences and stopping them. The creak of his porch chair. At the very end, his voice cracked through. I'm sorry I never came to your ceremonies, Pip. I told myself you didn't need your old man there.
I was wrong about that.
He hung up. It was the most words he'd given me in a year. Kristen texted on Thursday. I'm sorry about the daycare comment. That was bad. I texted back. It was. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. Lorraine. Nothing. No call. No text.
No voice email.
No appearance at my apartment door with a casserole and an apology. I did not expect one. My mother's ability to reshape reality around her own comfort was her oldest and most practiced skill. One waiting room was not going to retire it. But Darlene told me something the following Sunday. At church, after the service, someone asked Lorraine about her children and Lorraine said, my son runs a construction company and my daughter is a trauma surgeon at UT Medical Center.
No qualified. No diminishment.
No, she helps out. For the first time in 10 years, Lorraine spoke the truth to the people whose opinions she valued most.
She didn't say it to me.
She said it to her congregation, where reputation is built and maintained by repetition. And maybe that means more than any phone call could. I didn't win that day because my boss walked into the waiting room. I won years before that. The first night, I held a scalpel under fluorescent light and knew with every nerve in my hand that this was exactly where I belonged. The lake just made the rest of the world catch up. My family might take longer, but I stopped waiting for them to see me. I already knew who I was. The scalpel always did. That's my story. One lake party, one near drowning, and one word from a colleague that unwound 10 years of lies in 5 seconds flat. If this story reminded you that your worth is not decided by the people who refuse to see it, hold on to that.